Hello, and welcome to History 1152. In this video, we are going to discuss life in the American South, from the end of Reconstruction to the early 20th century. But before we do this, I'm going to provide a brief recap of the U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction. The Civil War was fought between the Southern slave states, organized into the Confederate States of America, the CSA, and the Union, which included all of the northern free states, as well as several border states that still had legal slavery of African Americans. The war was fought primarily because many in the southern states were dissatisfied with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the rise of the Republican Party. Lincoln and the Republicans promised not to end slavery where it presently existed, but they did want to pass legislation to prevent the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, which were in the process of becoming states. The strongest support for the war came from the Deep South, while the Upper South, states like Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, were much more reluctant to leave the Union. They agreed to secede and join the Confederacy after President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to defeat the Confederacy after the Battle of Fort Sumter. The war was fought from April of 1861 to April of 1865. The war was not initially waged to end slavery, but President Lincoln added the abolition of slavery to the Union's war goals with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. The war had a devastating effect on the United States. Over 600,000 soldiers died, and countless more civilians in the South died because of the war, about 2% of the nation's population. It would be like if over 6 million Americans died today in a war. The war also devastated large portions of the South's built environments, primarily its agricultural, transportation, and nascent industrial sectors, especially in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. Meanwhile, the northern economic, industrial, and military sectors grew as a result of the war, creating what some scholars call a Yankee Leviathan. The United States Congress passed the 13th Amendment in January of 1865, ending slavery in the United States, and the law would be applied to the defeated southern states, who would have to include the amendment in their constitutions in order to rejoin the Union. The southern states outlawed slavery, but enacted a series of what were called black codes, which were a series of discriminatory laws designed to constrain the liberties of the freedmen and keep them in a state that was what some scholars call slavery in all but name, and deny them the rights of U.S. citizens, including the right to vote, move freely, and control their labor. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president and a Southern Democrat, who succeeded Lincoln after he was assassinated, allowed the states to pass these codes. In response, Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, passed the Civil Rights Acts of 1866, along with the 14th and 15th Amendments in 1868 and 1870, to guarantee Southern blacks citizenship rights, since they had been born in the U.S., and black males the right to vote. They also disenfranchised many former Confederates, allowing Republicans to gain majorities in several Southern states. Meanwhile, paramilitary organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, founded by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest in 1865, attacked and killed blacks and whites that supported the Republicans in Reconstruction, essentially making the Klan the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party. President Ulysses S. Grant, a former Union general, elected in 1868, supported the radical Republicans and helped to pass a series of enforcement acts that used federal troops and local militia to suppress paramilitary activities, all but defeating the KKK. The Panic of 1873, a severe recession that hit in the first year of Grant's second term, severely damaged his mandate to reconstruct the South. because of the high cost of military occupation and economic assistance to the freedmen. What is more, Northerners were becoming tired of violence and the high cost that went into reconstructing the recalcitrant South. Reconstruction came to an end in 1877 with the Tilden Compromise. During the 1876 presidential election, the Republican nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, was in danger of losing the election to Samuel J. Tilden of the Democrats. During the election, there had been widespread reports of voter intimidation of blacks and white Republicans. Republicans made a deal with the Democrats. If the Democrats agreed to allow Hayes to be elected, then the Republicans would end Reconstruction and allow the Southern Democrats, called Redeemers, to take control of their states. Both parties agreed, Tilden was elected, and the Redeemer Democrats once again had control of the South. The Redeemers passed a series of decrees that varied somewhat by state called Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws, which took their name from a stereotypical character that portrayed blacks as inferior, denied African Americans the right to vote, move freely in the South, own firearms, and to fully bargain for their own labor. Black people who could not prove they were gainfully employed could be arrested for vagrancy and imprisoned, where they would be made to do hard labor. The Jim Crow laws also segregated public and private spaces throughout the South. The slaughterhouse cases of 1873 and Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, prevented the U.S. government from striking down the Jim Crow laws, which had violated the Constitution. When we talk about Reconstruction, we do not simply mean the rebuilding of the Southern infrastructure and economy after it had been devastated by the Civil War. Reconstruction was meant to do this, but also reform Southern society, which had come to be based around the protection of slavery and white supremacy, which held that blacks were inferior to whites in order to justify their enslavement. The Civil War brought an end to slavery, but did not bring an end to white supremacy in the South. Most Southern whites agreed that slavery could not be brought back after the Civil War, but white supremacy could continue, allowing them to maintain a pre-Civil War social structure, just without the peculiar institution of slavery. After 1877, most white Southern leaders envisioned a New South, a term that was originally coined by Henry Grady. The New South would have strong transportation infrastructure networks, an industrial sector to rival the North, and raw material exports based on both mass resource extraction and the plantation system. These reformers realized the South needed to change to keep up with the North. The region had been lagging behind the northern states in infrastructure, industry, and in social institutions, especially public education. Redeeming reformers wanted to modernize the South, but they also wanted to maintain white supremacy. Why did the Redeemers want to preserve white supremacy? Scholars have outlined several reasons. First and foremost, the Redeemers, like most white Americans, in both the North and the South, held racist ideas and believed that blacks were inferior to whites. The history and development of racism in the United States is very complicated and goes back to far before 1877, and we do not have time to fully discuss it here. Second, the reason that the elite reformers supported white supremacy came because they needed to keep poor white and black people divided. After the Civil War, Southern whites, along with blacks, struggled to survive in the war-torn region. They had many things in common. Many had lost their homes and had no place to live. Many had no other recourse than to work as sharecroppers. In the sharecropping system, farmers, called sharecroppers, would grow crops on the land of a plantation owner and would give a portion of their produce to the planter, who acted as a landlord. Because of the Jim Crow laws, blacks often had to give over large portions of their crops that they had grown to the planter, who in some cases had been their former master. Poor whites also had to agree to work under very similar conditions, or else not be able to work the land at all. Poor whites also worked alongside blacks in industrial and resource extraction settings, especially in mining and logging. Blacks and whites, especially women, often worked together in domestic settings, as maids, cooks, and nurses as well, although women at this time generally preferred to work in their own homes, if possible. In many ways, poor whites had more in common with the average black person than they did with the whites of the landowning and managerial classes. Rich whites observed the organization and strikes that occurred in the North, where the working classes were mostly white, although it was a mix of immigrant and native-born whites. These workers came together to agitate for better wages and working conditions. The Southern elite were determined not to let this kind of protest take off amongst poor whites and blacks, as their protests would threaten their authority and their bottom lines. Some Southern politicians, like Thomas E. Watson of Georgia, attempted to unite poor blacks and whites in the 1890s, leading these groups to join the populist movement. After the Populists failed to elect their candidate, William Jennings Bryan, of the Democratic Party, in the 1896 and 1900 elections, Watson abandoned his galvanizing anti-racist policies in favor of white supremacy. Watson's failed attempt to unite poor whites and blacks in the South in the 1890s was a testament to the power and appeal of white supremacy among white voters. White voters, even though those who were poor, preferred to vote as a race rather than as a class, to advocate for their own best economic interests. As stated before, it was easier for whites to fall back on their old belief that blacks were inferior and that their best chance for social advancement was to ingratiate themselves with the white upper class. The upper class could continue to control the South's economy and politics with an expansive labor base of black and white workers who would not rally together for better working conditions and higher wages. Not all white Southerners supported this system, though. Reformers like Thomas Watson in the 1890s attempted to unite poor whites and blacks, and even a handful of former Confederate officers questioned the systems that kept the New South going. James Longstreet, a former Confederate general, seen here, was one of them. Longstreet worked to help the Republican Party elect Ulysses S. Grant. Longstreet also tried to prevent the massacre of African Americans at Colfax, Louisiana in 1873. A handful of other white Southerners also challenged white supremacy, but they were hated and reviled by most white Southerners, who called them scalawags. Now that we've talked about some of the major trends and issues of life in the post-Reconstruction South, let us talk a little bit about life in the New South. As stated before, African Americans were denied the basic rights of citizens. They could not vote, move about the region without proof of employment, own firearms, or fully bargain for their labor. The states also forbade interracial marriages as well. Most African Americans worked in the agricultural sector, as farm laborers and sharecroppers, and in conditions much like those they endured during slavery. While black families could not be sold by masters or whipped by overseers, they were often attacked and assaulted by their white managers, who did not want to bargain with their black employees and preferred to force them to work as if they were still slaves. Black people who did not prove their employment could be arrested, imprisoned, and made to work in chain gangs. These chain gangs worked on public projects like roads, but convict labor could also be rented out to private interests, essentially allowing wealthy whites to buy the servitude of blacks. The imprisonment of black men, and women to a lesser degree, led to the breakup of black families. Although many elements of social control had been common during slavery, and they persisted into the New South, this does not mean that black people always had worse lives under the Jim Crow laws than they did during slavery. Far from it. Black people had more freedom in the New South, working as sharecroppers and industrial workers. They had the opportunity to choose where they lived on their plantations, to set up their own homesteads, rather than living in communal quarters as they had done as slaves. Black people also had other work opportunities in the New South, especially in the burgeoning resource extraction industries. Blacks worked alongside white workers in the logging and mining industries, and were paid direct wages, rather than sharing their crops. Black men also sought employment working on railroads as well. Railroad work was considered a prestigious job, especially for African Americans. The steady wages promised financial security, allowing black men to provide for their families. Railroad work also allowed black workers to safely travel across the South, as projects expanded throughout the region, and allowed them to see the South beyond their homes without fear of arrest for lack of employment. The work also gave black men the opportunity to meet other black people in other parts of the South, giving them an opportunity to share their experiences through story and song, especially blues music. The legend of John Henry, a black man who worked on the railroad during this period, has become an important part of American folklore. Another important area where black people had better lives in the post-Reconstruction South came in the form of the educational opportunities they now had. During slavery, anti-literacy laws were placed across the South that made it a crime to teach a slave how to read. After the war, African American children, especially those from the emerging middle class, were able to go to school, although they did so in segregated institutions, and public schools as a whole in the South lagged behind those in the North. One such educated African American who went on to advocate for black rights during this period was Ida B. Wells. Wells was born in 1862 as a slave, attended African American schools in Mississippi and Tennessee, and went on to become a teacher, investigative journalist, and activist. For most of her journalistic career, Wells documented lynchings and other extra-legal killing of African Americans in the South. She published her articles in African American newspapers and published her findings in a series of books, including Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. People of all races were lynched, but black men were the most likely people to be lynched in the New South. Over 4,000 people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Over 3,000 of them were African American, and over 1,200 were white. Nearly three-quarters of the lynchings occurred in the South, according to the Tuskegee Institute. The next slide will show where most of the lynchings occurred in this country. Wells' research on lynchings eventually forced her to leave the South because she drew attention to the violence that white Southerners were committing against blacks, embarrassing many whites in the region who preferred to keep these killings quiet, or to excuse them as being random acts of violence that had not been inspired by white supremacy. The last thing the Southern elite and their supporters wanted people to see was the violence that was required to keep black people in a subordinate position. Subordination in Jim Crow meant far more than legal subservience of blacks. It extended to cultural and social interactions between white and black people. Jim Crow laws and the unwritten customs that came with it demanded segregation, but also that black people yield to whites in social interactions. Blacks were expected to show deference to whites by stepping off the sidewalk to allow whites to pass, or yielding to whites while lining up at checkout in general stores. Jim Crow also governed interracial gender relations. Whites often referred to black males of all ages as boy. Black men had to be very careful when talking to white women. In many cases, black men were punished for supposedly making advances on white women, and only black men who were lynched or killed because they had been suspected of sexually assaulting a white woman. While anti-miscegenation laws passed during this period forbade whites and blacks from having sexual relations, white society was far more permissive of white men having relations with black women than it was of black men making advances on white women. It was another element of the Jim Crow system and white supremacy. Black men were forbidden from having intimate relations with white women, under the belief that white women had to be protected from black men, who were cast as dangerous and sexually aggressive. Black women, however, were not given this same level of social protection from white men, even though the states legally forbade all interracial relationships. White Southerners may also have been more accepting of relationships between white men and black women because during slavery, many masters had children with their female slaves. Even well-known African American leaders like Frederick Douglass, an enslaved person who escaped to freedom and went on to become one of the most important African American leaders in the 19th century, was fathered by a white man, probably his master. Another important African American leader who, like Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass, was born a slave was Booker T. Washington. Washington, born in Virginia in 1856, became a leading African American educator and activist. Washington attended a historically black college and helped to found the Tuskegee Institute, an important African American intellectual center. Washington proposed a policy called racial uplift. Racial uplift mandated that African Americans focus on education and entrepreneurship to demonstrate to white Americans that, that they deserved political equality and that they were worthy of citizenship. He urged black people to cast down your bucket where you are and focus on self-improvement rather than activism. Washington's message resonated with many African Americans who saw him as a symbol of what they could become, an educated, wealthy, and influential man that was respected by white people. Indeed, many whites liked Washington. He offered advice to several U.S. presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt, who personally met with Washington and had him as a guest at the White House. Conversely, a new generation of African American thinkers and activists, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, disagreed with Washington and believed that the fight for legal equality should come first, and economic and social advancement should come later. Washington and his supporters met with white Southern leaders in Atlanta in 1895. Washington and his supporters agreed that they would not challenge the rule of white Southerners, and that white Southern leadership would sponsor African American schools and would do more to assure black people due process, especially against lynching, which had been a major issue for blacks as well as whites, thanks to the journalism of Ida B. Wells. In exchange, Washington's followers would not challenge the Jim Crow system. After Washington's death in 1915, African American activists moved away from the Washingtonian model of racial uplift and instead focused on fighting for equality before the law first. Despite the leadership of African American leaders like Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois, most African Americans living in the South endured great poverty, discrimination, and violence, leading many to leave the region, heading north to urban centers, especially Chicago and New York City. We will talk about these great migrations in future lectures. We've talked quite a bit about how African Americans dealt with social and economic change in the New South, but we haven't talked as much about how everyday white people reacted to the changes that were taking place in the New South, and in the United States as a whole after the Civil War. As I said before, the Civil War had a devastating effect on the South. Some of the region's largest population centers, especially Richmond, Atlanta, Columbia, and Charleston, were all but destroyed. Agricultural production was also severely damaged and would not reach pre-war levels for over a decade in some parts of the South. The damage to the Southern economy, combined with the occupation of Southern states, made white Southerners angry and resentful, as they struggled to provide for themselves with the loss of their possessions, which, for about a quarter of Southern whites, included slaves. The fact that black people gained their freedom because of the war and celebrated the Union victory only angered white Southerners further, as it seemed that black people had benefited at the expense of whites. This hatred and resentment made white Southerners of all classes eager to support white supremacy in the New South, because the system promised economic rebirth along with the subordination of black people. White Southerners created a political ideology called the Lost Cause to help them come to terms with their military defeat, while at the same time justifying a system that kept black people in a position of subordination. The Lost Cause was a form of political propaganda developed by Edward Pollard and other former Confederates in 1866. Like most effective forms of propaganda, it mixed elements of fact and fiction, and it played to the accomplishments but also the insecurities of its intended audience. Lost Cause propagandists argued that the Confederacy lost the war because it had a smaller population and was more agricultural than industrial. They also argued that Southern society was more traditional, almost like a medieval system, where plantation owners were like feudal lords and Confederate generals were like gallant chevaliers, and that it was doomed to failure against the aggressively modern North. There is some truth to these tenets of the Lost Cause. The South's economy relied more on agriculture and was more rural than the North, but the North still had a large agricultural center, and most of its population still lived in rural environments. The Southern plantation system did share many similarities with feudalism, but this is hardly a flattering comparison. The Lost Cause cast Northerners as greedy capitalists bent only on profit. They thought in terms of dollars and cents and treated their workers poorly. This point resonated with many white Southerners, who observed the growth of industrialization during the Gilded Age and the rise of the corrupt robber barons, and wanted no part in this system. The Lost Cause offered a distorted view of the past that would appeal to aging Confederate veterans who had been nostalgic for their youth. It also resonated with young white people who had been born after the Civil War and did not know the challenges that people of all races faced. Perhaps the most egregious elements of the Lost Cause were the outright falsehoods that it peddled about the reason the Civil War was fought, and about how enslaved African Americans responded to their bondage. Lost Cause propagandists imagined a society in which enslaved Africans, who were supposedly inferior to whites, did not resent their enslavement but preferred it to freedom, because in a free society they would have to take care of themselves. They also obscured the reason that the Confederate States seceded. Rather than an attempt to preserve the power of slave-owning interests in American politics, Southerners allegedly seceded because they wanted to defend states' rights, or because the North and the South had become too culturally and economically different to be part of the same country. While it is true that Southern culture was distinct, even peculiar to the culture of the North, scholars have argued that Southerners and Northerners on the eve of the Civil War were more similar than different, and that diverging lifeways would not have been enough to provoke armed conflict between the two sections of the country. Despite the misconceptions of the Lost Cause, its justification of racism against African Americans, many whites in both the South and the North began to accept the Lost Cause mythology, especially from the 1880s on. But why would Northerners adopt the Lost Cause? Didn't it portray them in a negative light? Scholars think that many Northerners adopted Lost Cause thinking because it questioned the benefits of industrial capitalism and encouraged a return to a more traditional society, something which appealed to many Northerners who were concerned about the corruption and degradation they saw in American society during the Gilded Age. Northerners were also able to adopt the Lost Cause because they, like most Southerners, were believers in white supremacy. Finally, Northerners also came around to the Lost Cause because they saw it as a way to bring the South into the national fold by lionizing Southern conduct in the Civil War, while also obscuring the role that slavery played in participating in the conflict. While most white Southerners supported the Lost Cause, there were a few high-profile individuals who condemned the ideology as a fiction, including former Confederate General James Longstreet, who we talked about earlier. Ultimately, though, the Lost Cause did galvanize Northern and Southern whites. It allowed them to forget the violence of the Civil War by romanticizing the conflict, and it obscured the conflict's true casus belli. Finally, the Lost Cause helped to prop up the New South by casting the white Southern elite as benevolent paternalists who took care of slaves and poor whites. This kept the poor whites of the South from making common cause with free blacks, allowing a white supremacist system in which blacks were denied the most basic rights of free people to continue. That is all for our lecture on the economy, culture, and people of the New South. In the next lecture, we will talk about the American West and the massive changes the region saw in the late 19th century. You will see many similarities, but also some differences in the challenges the people of the West faced during this period.